It's one of the most unthinkable acts in all of combat sports. Quitting, giving up, conceding defeat, and not in the middle of the fray where perhaps the punishment is too much, or during a submission you know you can't escape, but between rounds in your corner, making the conscious choice to say that you're done.
He is saying I don't want any more. God. Are you kidding me?
It's an action that's been stigmatized by MMA culture since the early days, to the point where we often criticize corners for not throwing in the towel first to save the fighter face. Personally, I'm not big on ridiculing fighters for this. Like, I'm not getting in the cage, so who am I to talk about continuing a fight? And most of the time, I think they made the right call for themselves and their careers. However you feel about it though, these exceedingly rare moments at the highest level are stories worth telling, so let's tell them. What's up, fight fans? It's Fight Week. UFC 314 is upon us, and a new featherweight champion will be crowned as Alexander Volkanovski returns to take on Diego Lopez. So, being partnered with DraftKings, you know we have you covered. All new customers who bet $5 on anything will receive $150 in bonus bets instantly, and you can stay in on the action and use your $150 in bonus bets on DraftKings same game parlays for a shot at an even bigger payout. Combine multiple bets together from the same fight, including total number of rounds and method of victory. The more bets you combine, the more you can win. If sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't worry. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Daily Fantasy and have the shot to win cash prizes. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use the promo code ONPOINT and bet just $5 on any wager and get $150 in bonus bets instantly. That's promo code ONPOINT only at DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and these are 10 times UFC fighters quit on the stool. A quick note, Raquel Pennington's loss to Amanda Nunes will not be included in this list, as she very famously was not allowed to quit on the stool and suffered the consequences as a result.
I didn't want to give up, but the frustrations were overcoming everything, along with the pain that I felt.
Number 10, Norman Paraisy versus James Hammertree. You know, I feel kind of bad putting this entry in here, but it's one of the most blatant stool quits that's ever been seen on a UFC product. It was the first episode of the Liddell Ortiz season of Tough, and Norman was there to fight his way into the house and prove that the French people are not an easy fight, like so many in the United States assume.
The mindset of people about the spirit of French fighter gonna definitely change. In a good way.
His opponent, James Hammertree, cool name, would not do him any favors though, beating him up pretty soundly for the first whole round, but especially at the end. Paraisy returned to his corner a bit wobbly, but this was certainly not a round you'd have expected to end the fight. Norman immediately told John Hackleman that he was done and that he quit. Hackleman was confused and tried to get Paraisy back up off the stool, but he kept giving him more reasons. He couldn't feel his legs, he couldn't feel his body, his wrist hurt. When the referee swung by to see what was up, Paraisy waved the proverbial white flag, and that was that.
Embarrassing. Yeah, it's embarrassing. You freaking quit.
Chuck Liddell was very unhappy, and stereotypes about the French would remain until Cyril Gane probably. Number 9, Gan McGee versus Pedro Hizo. Here's a fun, well, not for Hizo, old school stool quit that I found by going back through every UFC TKO listed as retirement or corner stoppage. Following his back-to-back title fight losses to Randy Couture, the first of which was the best fight of 2001, Pedro Hizo bounced back with a KO win over Andrei Arlovski that has aged incredibly well. His next opponent was the stupidly tall Chuck Liddell teammate Gan McGee, who had a 10-1 record at the time. Very unique to this list, it was a single shot that did this one in. There wasn't a ton of action in the fight until McGee blasted Hizo with a big right hand at the very end of the first round, opening up a cut on the bridge of the nose. Pedro could immediately be seen shaking his head no when going back to his corner, and you don't need to speak the Portuguesa like Mike Goldberg to know that Hizo is telling every single person involved that he's done. And the cut is obviously not a fight ender. The doctor didn't step in, he wasn't in any danger, and you can see his corners trying to get him to go to the next round, but Pedro was just done. He didn't even stick around for the decision to be read, he just walked right to the back immediately. Rough night at the office, I guess. Number 8, Petr Yan versus Douglas Silva de Andrade. One of the most famous moments in boxing history was the legendary stool quit when Roberto Duran famously uttered no mas to his corner following the 7th round of his rematch with Sugar Ray Leonard. Well, MMA got its very own no mas moment at UFC 232, it's just that it was a prelim fight on FS1 and not one of the biggest welterweight title bouts ever, so definitely didn't get the same level of attention. This was was a very early Petr Yan showing, his third UFC bout. He hadn't even broken into the top 15 yet, but he put on a clinic against Douglas Silva de Andrade. The first round was solid, but in the second, man, he absolutely battered Silva de Andrade, especially for the last few minutes on the ground. Doug was a whole ass mess headed over to the corner, and it sounded like initially he told them quietly no mas, but it would take some more obvious body language and discussion for it to come out again, with the coach confirming the no mas call.
No mas. No mas. They called it.
And the fight was waved off. Can't say I blame Silva de Andrade one bit on this one. Round 3 would have been ugly. Live to fight another day. Number 7, CB Dollaway versus Khalid Murtazuviev. Here's a great example of a fighter quote-unquote quitting on the stool that drew absolutely no criticism at all, in large part because fans were angry with referee Herb Dean. Dollaway had the unfortunate pleasure of welcoming Khalid Murtazuviev to the UFC all the way in Moscow, in what would be the second to last fight of his MMA career. CB's 25-year-old opponent would score a pretty nasty body shot towards the end of the first round that seemed to really take it out of the veteran fighter, which was apparent in the closing minute or so of the second round, in which Khalid beat the brakes off him on the ground, with every single bit of Dollaway's body posture saying that I've resigned my fate. You can step in at any time, Herb. But Herb did not. In what could have been the original hashtag stop the fight moment from Dan Hardy, Dean inexplicably let CB just get beat up while offering no resistance but covering up his face. After the horn, Dollaway dismissed his corner's stool and he immediately signaled that he was done, to the confusion of Herb Dean, who told him, hey, you need to get up on your stool. Still not getting the hint, Dollaway outright informed the referee that he was done, and finally the fight was called off. I guess if the referee isn't going to do their job, you sometimes have to do it for them. Number 6, Cynthia Calvillo versus Andrea Lee. Moving to flyweight in 2020 was promising for Cynthia Calvillo as she scored a UD on recent title contender Jessica Ai right out of the gate. But following that win, Calvillo would drop back-to-back fights against two near the top of the division in Caitlin Chukagian and Jessica Andrade. She next took a 3-week notice bout with Andrea KGB Lee, who had just broken a 3-fight skid via triangle armbar against Sister Shevchenko. And so that's the setup for this soulless Apex Center throwdown. And man, this was just your classic case of breaking somebody down with a ton of little shots. Lee's jab was the story of the fight, her jab and the volume. She'd land 85 strikes and throw 211, a crazy pace. And I swear 95% of those landed right in Cynthia's face. By the end of the second, it was just too much and Calvillo would bow out on the stool. Afterwards, Michael Bisping talked about how there's no shame at all in quitting on the stool, with fellow fighter commentator Paul Felder in agreement. Was actually a pretty great moment considering the stigma that normally surrounds fighters calling it between rounds. Number 5, Nate Marquardt versus Kelvin Gastelum. Man, this one hits really hard. Nate Marquardt had by any definition a hell of a career in MMA. Is he an all-time great? No, but not a lot of people can say they were the king of pancrase. Say they were a Strikeforce champion that defeated Tyron Woodley. Say they competed against Anderson Silva for UFC gold. By the time Nate got into the cage with Kelvin Gastelum, he'd seen it all, and the best of times were well behind him, having lost 4 of his last 5 at 36 years old and coming up on what would be his 50th fight. There wasn't a ton left in the tank, and unfortunately for Marquardt, he got the version of Gastelum all men fear. Relentless pace, hard to hit, and a ton of damage created by a ton of volume. Nate was 2 steps behind from moment 1, and after 10 minutes, he could barely get back up to go to the stool. As he sat down, he told Trevor Whitman possibly the most honest thing I've ever heard a fighter say.
I have nothing left. Okay, it's over.
It's over.
Whitman immediately called the fight off, and rightly so. There was no comeback. There was not going to be anything but a knockout. Whitman said that afterwards Marquardt was upset and said he could have gone out there in the third and tried to throw one big shot. But luckily that thought crept in after he'd already told his corner what they needed to hear. Number 4, Chris Leben versus Uriah Hall. I think if you asked fans to list off the toughest fighters in UFC history, the ones that could really just take any and all punishment, I would have to think that Chris Leben ends up on the majority of those lists. The guy was the embodiment of that zombie through shots mentality during his peak, and it was a huge part of what made Leben such a popular fighter. So if there's ever someone that could help destigmatize quitting between rounds, it's a guy that there's no chance in hell any fan is ever going to question has an insane level of toughness. Going into the 2013 bout with Uriah Hall, who had yet to see a UFC win, Leben was absolutely in the twilight of his career, having lost 4 of his last 5. Everybody assumed he'd probably be hanging up the gloves soon. It was just a matter of when, and that win would be this night. Hall put it on Leben the whole first 5 minutes, really busting him up, and he followed that up in the final seconds with a knockdown and a near stoppage. When Leben got back up, he wasn't sure if they'd stopped the fight or if the round had ended, but when he sat down in his corner, he told them straight up,
I'm done, man. You're good. Focus. I'm done. Stop it. Okay.
It really felt more than anything that Leben knew this was the end of his career, not just this fight. The resignation was written all over his face. The guy was done. Leben would go on to do bare knuckle though, of course, and now he's an official. Good for him. Number 3, Max Rohskopf versus Austin Hubbard. When you look up MMA fighters quitting on the stool, and this is true, an unusual number of the results are related to Max Rohskopf, which is a brutal thing for a guy who was just making his UFC debut. Even the first pick of him, when you search his name, is of the moment he bowed out of the fight with Austin Hubbard, and perhaps in large part, it's because this would be his only ever UFC fight. He would be cut from the promotion immediately afterwards. That, and more so than most of the entries on this list, a lot of fans very vocally felt he just plain quit, and it wasn't out of necessity. Dude had everything going for him too. Unbeaten at 5-0, already in the UFC, 25 years old, and a betting favorite against his opponent in his debut bout, despite taking it on 10 days notice. Everything screamed hot up-and-coming prospect. So after a certainly lopsided 10-8 second round, where he took a lot of damage, it looked like the fading Rohskopf was probably doomed in the third. But he wasn't about to let that happen, immediately asking for his coaches to call the fight.
Call it.
Hey, listen.
Call it.
Huh?
Call it.
Okay, catch your breath.
No.
We're gonna beat this guy.
Call
Keep
it.
it on feet, you're gonna clinch.
No, call it.
The referee caught wind and asked the fighter, who confirmed to the official that he was done. The nature of the fight, of Max being seen as maybe a hot prospect, and how clearly this all played out in the silence of the Apex, was the perfect storm, and the backlash and debate over a debuting fighter on the prelims of an Apex card was a lot larger than you'd expect, and left Max considering walking away from the sport. After more than a year away, he returned at Cage Warriors for a 2-fight run before losing his Bellator debut in early 2023. He has not fought since. Number 2, Anthony Pettis versus Tony Ferguson. This is the definitive Tony Ferguson moment in my eyes. Not just because the performance was classic El Kukui, but because it was as the co-main event of that 229 card under Conor and Khabib. A main event he very well could have been in himself without the disaster that was his freak knee injury. Back off just 6 months of recovery, his own rehab too, mind you, not doctor supervised, from a full FCL tear. Just insane. In front of him, the always game Anthony Pettis, who got absolutely put through it in this fight. And yes, he did break his hand in the first round of that bout, but there was a lot more going on here than that. The pressure of Ferguson was just drowning Showtime from the opening bell, and those last 2 minutes of the second round, the look on Pettis' face as this barrage of strikes is endlessly being thrown at him, you can feel the desperation to just survive what's coming at him. In having watched so many of these moments for this video, I've noticed that most fighters don't want to say they quit, even though that's what they want to do. They move their heads off to the side to speak. They whisper. Unfortunately for Pettis, Duke Rufus, who was only looking out for his best interests, of course, made Pettis state very loudly and clearly his intentions, while giving him an out with the hand, of course.
I can't have you fighting him if you didn't got that hand.
So that's the fight.
But there was absolutely no shame in walking away from that one. Ferguson had decimated him in those 10 minutes, and round 3 would have been nasty. Number 1, BJ Penn versus George St. Pierre 2. It's one of the biggest fights in MMA history, a true super fight between two all-time great legends in their primes, and one that BJ Penn built on a premise that it was going to go to the death, a quote famously pulled from the Countdown show in the lead up to the event. I think the line is probably so memorable still because of how things actually played out. The pair had met 3 years previous in a welterweight title eliminator when Penn returned from K1, with GSP earning the split decision. This time around, both were champions in their respective divisions, and man, the hype for this one was off the charts. At the time, it felt like the peak of the UFC. Questions had always been there about Penn's endurance and training, and well, he did himself no favors with this one. 3 of the 4 rounds, you could easily argue 10-8s for GSP. It was just non-stop grappling and ground and pound ground pressure. BJ had absolutely nothing for St. Pierre, and in his corner before the start of the 5th, an exhausted Penn was asked by his team over and over if he still wanted this. And like many quitting on the stool moments, BJ said everything without saying much.
Herb Dean has stopped the fight! George St. Pierre!
To the death was the narrative going in, but GSP was able to break a fellow legend long before that. While we got someone literally saying no mas earlier, this is without a doubt the closest spiritual MMA equivalent to the Duran no mas moment, and it had to be number 1. You know who's never quit on the stool, but if they did, there would be no shame in it? The editor of this video, Max Randall. Please follow him on all his socials and go check out his awesome YouTube channel. A big ol' thanks to our channel members. Appreciate you very, very much. Fight fans, hit the join button, become a member as well, get exclusive content, and get videos early. Like and subscribe for lots more videos like today's. Leave a comment about what you think of quitting on the stool, and thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.